Okay, welcome to today's BAPT webinar. Here, hopefully coming out at the end of lockdown of the COVID crisis. Thanks for joining us. We've got a really interesting talk tonight about type and empirical research. It's an honor to welcome Dr. Mina Barimany here today from Washington, DC. She's a therapist and psychologist and has been doing a lot of research in this area. Her PhD thesis was on empirical type work as well. So I'd like to welcome her to the webinar. Thank you, and welcome Mina.
Thank you, Richard.
So just to get started, just curious about your kind of background and how you came to first learn and find out about type, and how did it come into your life in this career that you're in?
Yeah, so I think many of you are probably familiar with my brother-in-law, Eric. He was the first person who started talking type with me probably around the age of 15, but I didn't really start paying attention until around 20. And once I realized that I was going to get into psychology for my career, then, my ears started perking up and I started paying a little closer attention. And it sort of took on a life of its own. I ended up doing my dissertation on type and continued to do the work because that's just kind of where my interests are. So that's how I got here.
So now you're a practicing psychologist, therapist, and do you have your own practice?
I do. I own a private practice in DC, and I'll talk a little bit about some of my experiences there. But I see people between the ages of 20 and 40, so what we would roughly consider the emerging adulthood period. But I also teach full-time at Hopkins and do all these other passion projects kind of on the side of those two things.
So what sort of range of different models and methods do you use in your work, and what place does typology play in that as well?
So I would say that as far as formal models go, type probably plays the biggest role or has the biggest influence in how I think about human development. But other models that tend to typically come into my space is third wave cognitive behavioral therapy, and this is more particular to my work with my clients. The interpersonal process model, and of course psychodynamic, which is sort of a derivative of the school that Jung came from, the psychoanalytic community.
Right, and so obviously, I guess psychodynamic Jungian studies has been part of your work as well.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
So, in terms of type, what kind of roots of type have you tended to study in? Have you gone back to Jung a great deal, to his original works, or what kind of aspects of discovering type have you been through?
Yeah, so I think that's actually one of the defining features of the work that I do, is that I made a distinct decision to go back to Jung's original work to do some empirical validation of his theories and ideas. Whereas most of the field in today's day and age is focused on validation of assessment instruments, I really wanted to go back to the original theory and see, does the data support what Jung thought about how the psyche grows and develops over the lifespan? And aside from that, I think most of my observations have been anecdotal. I mean, I look inward to understand type, much like Jung taught or did and wanted most of us to do, is to look inward to understand how these different pieces actually function in real life. So, yeah.
So through your own work with yourself, how have you learned about yourself in different ways? What sort of great insights have you had that have been impactful for you?
Yeah, so actually the answer to that question parallels really closely with why I actually decided to do this research. But so I would probably fall under the label of what we would think of as an INTJ now in my life. But before, when I was younger, both my parents were F. And so I think what happened was that there just wasn't a lot of space for me to grow my thinking function. And so once I sort of differentiated from my family of origin, I went off to school, I just kind of looked around and realized like something just doesn't fit right. And I started to sort of get rid of the things that didn't feel like they worked for me, which was essentially the extroverted feeling just didn't feel right to me. And I think it just opened up a little bit of space to start developing a different part of my mind. And so when I look at the array of functions that I have access to as an individual, introverted intuition is like my hammer and everything is a nail for sure. I'm working on my own ways of balancing that out. But I think I can also do extroverted feeling pretty well just because I was exposed to it because of my family. And then I think recently I've been able to develop my thinking, and I think probably a little bit of both directions. And so, you know, when I look at my stack, I've probably got 2 judging functions and a dominant perceiving function, and maybe I've got the beginnings of the development of introverted thinking. But, you know, that's sort of the arrangement of how I think my personality is currently comprised of, which is something that I saw mirrored in my research, interestingly enough.
So it's great you're talking about typology from an 8-function perspective there straight away from the start. And, you know, is that how you find it's best to look at this in terms of how you recognize it in your life?
I think that's a great question. Yes, the 8 functions for sure, particularly when I'm looking at development from sort of a research point of view. I also think there's a lot of value in collapsing and expanding those categories. So moving away from the 8 function to maybe a 4 function. So just the 4 pure sensing, intuiting, thinking, feeling, and then maybe expanding it to a 32 function model. The 16 function model where we look at the dominant and the auxiliary put together. So I think there's value in different arrangements of Jung's building blocks, essentially.
Yeah, I guess that some of them are more abstract levels and some are more close to actually experience. But like you said, I think I can say that I find the 8-function level to be closer to what you can recognize popping up in your actual experience. You know, you know when one of the 8 functions is kind of running the show in a moment in your life, and you're becoming one-sided. So in terms of your PhD thesis, where did that take you with the 8 functions then?
Let's see. So I don't want to give away the juicy part of my presentation too soon, but I think the main conclusions is, as far as the array of 8 functions go, I think we have access in varying degrees to all 8 functions, and there's a clear tendency towards certain ones over others. And so that has certain implications for my work as a therapist, you know, in human development theory. And that was demonstrated really clearly in both Mark Majors' data and also in Dario Nardi's data that I'll share with you all today.
Right. Well, we're looking forward to seeing the data in a minute. Let's not spoil it. No spoilers for now. But just a little bit more then about your own journey then. So what typically, you said you work with people with relationships as one area, and I know that's quite a powerful thing to work with type. So what sort of conflicts do you see coming up from the sort of one-sidedness of type that appears in your practice?
Specifically with couples or just in general?
Oh, I guess whatever you'd like to share with us, really. But yeah, couples are quite interesting usually.
Yeah, they are. It does add a level of exponentially complicated information there. Maybe I'll speak more generally, and I'll actually touch on this in my presentation, but what I end up seeing often is people land in my office sometime between the ages of 20 and 30 roughly, and I think it's probably a result of 2 things. Number one, they've spent most of their life cultivating the development and dependence on a dominant function that's worked pretty well for them throughout most of life. Something happens after college where, you know, we face sort of existential questions about family or career, you know, our place in life, what we want to make our life, and, you know, problems become more complex than they were in earlier parts of our life. And the one function that we were depending on isn't really cutting it to help us manage through the increasing complexity of life. And so, and then the other thing I think happens is that the problems have sort of existed all along, but they hit critical mass when you have to differentiate and, you know, kind of become an adult. And so you end up with symptoms of anxiety and depression because they're trying to use the thing that worked for them really well, but it's just not doing the job. And so we need to sort of find a way to adapt, which, you know, Jung talked about quite a lot. And so when you talk about one-sidedness, that's typically what I end up seeing, is somebody who's dealing with a lot of stress and anxiety and despair and stuckness and worry, because they have problems that they don't know how to manage, and the ways that worked for them before are no longer working for them.
Yeah, so you're helping them to move into other areas of functioning, really, that were kind of blind spots.
Exactly, yeah. And I think the reason why this research is important to me is that rather than guessing what somebody might need to do, I had some guesses about, the developmental trajectory for the different types, but the data really shows us that we don't have to guess. We can kind of guess where we can sort of know where someone needs to go in order to find that psychological balance that they're looking for.
Right. So, question about this being a talk about empirical work. Is it good to talk about what that word means? How are we defining empiricism, or is that something that's in the slides? Or should we move on to the slides?
Yeah. So I don't know if everyone can see it, but the first piece of the chat, I included a glossary. I did include the word empirical, but just for redundancy's sake, when we talk about empirical in this context, what I'm really referring to is something that's based on the collection and observation of data. In this presentation, it's quantitative data, it could be qualitative data, it could be anecdotal, but essentially it's rooted in the direct experience and observation of the phenomena. And so that's what we mean when we talk about empirical.
So it's kind of like it's saying that there's some kind of evidential basis for what we're doing, and we're not just making it up, I guess.
That's the hope.
But then that's where the other side of it is, like, it's not just making it up, but it could be based on a kind of logical or rational approach, which is kind of, I guess, where it differentiates in philosophy from other ways of coming to knowledge, which was perhaps that rationalist approach.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I like the word that you used earlier. I think the word is systematic. So there's a system to how you're collecting and categorizing the data.
Yeah, because that's a very important part of scientific research, obviously, is the systematic aspect. Although we were talking about, we could separate the two and say, empiricism purely is just that it's based on some kind of observation or experience, and then maybe the systematic thing has become combined with that as a necessity in current day. So what about Jung and his own claims of being an empiricist? How do you see that fitting into this as well?
That's a separate webinar, I guess, but the simplest answer, in my opinion, is that the proof is in the pudding. I think,
Sure, yeah.
At least in my experience of it, both in the work of the research, but also just on the ground level with my clients and with my students, like, it holds up from what I can see.
Yeah, so I suppose, like you say, he said himself, he based his work on almost 20 years of observing what his patients, his analysans were telling him about their experience, constantly over that amount of time. So it's a very in-depth study, if you want to put it that way, isn't it, that he based psychological types on. And yet many people today would say, sort of neglect that, the evidence, because it wasn't as systematic.
Exactly, yeah. Well, I think that also reflects just, there was a huge push towards positivist research, to create some sort of systematic way to do research that gave the data integrity. And I think now, once we've sort of established some of those ground rules for research, we can flex them a little bit and move back to something a little softer and more qualitative.
Excellent. So we move on to the slides and have a look then at
Sure.
the stuff you've discovered.
Okay, should I share my slides now?
Yes, yeah, go for it.
Okay. So, as we've talked about, today's discussion is going to be about pathways in type development. And just to back up, I wanted to just take a moment to thank the British Association for Type, and also you, Richard, for inviting me to talk today. It really is a privilege to share the work that I've been doing and have a captive audience. And I also wanted to thank Dario Nardi and Mark Majors, who, both mentors, but also made it possible for me to do this work by providing the data that I'm going to talk about with you all today. So just to give you a sense of what today's talk is going to look like, I'm going to start out by just giving a little bit of background with Jung's theory. I imagine I'm talking to some people who have varying degrees of comfort with the type theory model, so I'm going to breeze through that pretty quickly. Then I'm going to present some of the results from both the 2017 study and also the more recent 2020 study that I did on Dario's data. And then I'll leave a little bit of time at the end for the discussion and application of these ideas, and also just for people to ask some questions and have a conversation about this stuff, because I am quite interested in what people see when they look at the data. And just so a few housekeeping items. I'm happy to take questions, and I will be pausing here and there just to ask questions and make sure everybody's following. But I'm not going to be looking at the chat box because I can't multitask. So if you have a question and you don't have a chance to answer it, or ask it during the presentation, please save it for the end, or if you want to contact me offline and have a deeper conversation about some of the thoughts that this information triggers for you, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I live and breathe type, so I'm always excited to talk about it. Okay, so let's start by level setting with some type theory. And hopefully everybody can see on the top section of the chat, there's a bit of a glossary that I put in case you hear something and you're not quite sure how I'm using one of the words. You can look to that for some context. So Jung published his type theory about 100 years ago. And in his type model, he attempted to capture what he viewed as a paradox in human nature, that people's brains and their psyches have both very unique but also very universal traits. And so with the type theory system, he created a way to taxonomize these different types of consciousness. And in the words of Bibi, Jung actually made a very clear distinction that it wasn't about categorizing types of people. It was about trying to categorize types of thinking or types of consciousness. And so I want to be very clear that we don't want to misattribute the intent or the heart of Jung's model. So in his type theory, Jung created a tool that's a really valuable way to understand different ways of knowing and being. It's a way to organize different psychological epistemologies. And I'll talk a little bit more in just a few slides. So we start with the whole psyche. The reason why this is important is that ultimately Jung believed that it was integration that led to health and happiness psychologically. The first differentiation in his model are between the two very most basic processes that a human being can be engaged in. That's judgment and perception. So at any given time, we're either taking in data from the environment or we're trying to classify it and make meaning of it. And so the theory proposes that the psyche is comprised of judging functions and perceiving functions. And this is sort of the foundation of the taxonomy. The next differentiation is between the different functions. So we have two judging functions and two perceiving functions. The two judging functions being thinking and feeling, the two perceiving functions being sensing and intuiting. The next piece of the puzzle is attitude. Jung believed that these functions, each one of the four functions, could be used in an extroverted way or an introverted way. So on the left, this is a depiction of the introverted way, the subjective way, meaning you're in the first person experience of it, is rooted in the inner world, in the subjective experience of the phenomena. On the left is the extroverted. It's an illustration of the extroverted attitude, meaning the orientation is actually rooted in the environment. It's anchored in the external world. And so he believed that we could use each one of our four functions in an introverted or an extroverted way. And he called introversion and extroversion the attitudes. So with two attitudes and four functions, we end up with 8 function attitudes. Jung used the word function attitudes, but more commonly in the field, they're referred to as mental functions. And so these 8 mental functions are really what are, it's sort of the machinery of consciousness. These are the 8 different modes of being. And you can see that they're sort of arranged in a polarity. So we have extroverted intuition across from introverted intuition because they're a polarity in and of themselves. So now we know the what of the theory, and now we're going to start talking about the how. Everybody has a dominant function and an auxiliary function. The dominant function is essentially the thing that leads for an individual. What's important to remember here is that Jung proposed that everyone had a judging function and a perceiving function in the dominant or the auxiliary. So you had one of each. Everybody has one of each function. And if you're a dominant judger, your dominant function was judging and your auxiliary was perceiving. If you're a dominant perceiver, it's the other way around. And so that's kind of what this slide is depicting here. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of epistemological diversity. I mentioned before that a lot of the research to date has focused on the validation of some of the type instruments like the MBTI, all of the different assessments that have been published in order to classify or label type. And so we've kind of passed over going back to Jung's original theory to look at whether or not the data actually shows what Jung believed about human development in the psyche. So this is where my research focuses on. The research does have implications for testing and for classification, but that's another webinar for a different time. Type is important, or I believe type is important because it gives us a basic idea of what psychological growth can and should look like. It's sort of a Rosetta Stone. It gives us a pathway to understand where someone might be in their development and where they need to go in order to achieve greater health. Okay, so I mentioned the word psychological epistemology, and I just wanted to take a moment to describe what I really mean by that. So if we think about the person in the left-hand corner as a dominant sensor, and the person in the bottom right-hand corner as a dominant intuitor, what this is really showing is that these people, because of their predisposition toward a certain function over another, are paying attention to different things when they look at the same image. So type tells us why people have a very different epistemology. They have a very different system of knowledge because they're paying attention to different things. So any of you who know me probably also know that I'm a huge Cure fan. And so the image on the right is actually a postcard that Robert Smith created for a charity auction last year that I did consider bidding on, but I held myself back. And I'm fortunately $8,000 richer because I didn't buy it. But essentially, you know, the person on the top left, the sensor, looks at this image and sees the color red. It sees a granular pattern on the bottom half of the drawing. It also sees letters and words on the bottom left-hand corner. And then the person at the bottom left, the intuitor, looks at it and sees, ooh, this is like a creepy, weird balloon, and it's got this kind of macabre feeling to it because the string looks like a trickle of blood. And so this is just explaining why people see different things when they look at the same image. And this also is why type is so powerful. Okay. So what I often see in my practice, like I mentioned, is that people have grown accustomed to leaning on the dominant function, and it's worked pretty well. But what ends up happening is that they end up encountering problems that this dominant function really just can't help them with. And rather than changing tact, they tend to double down and try to use what they already know with more force. And so after hammering away long enough at a problem, they get frustrated and tired, and that shows up in the form of symptomatology around anxiety and depression, and then they land in my office. So let's talk a little bit about the research now. What I really wanted to explore in going into the data was whether or not my anecdotal observations of type are mirrored in the data, and whether or not what Jung proposed about type development actually also is supported by what we see in the data. So just for some context, the sample sizes that I was able to use in both the 2017 study and the 2020 study are really unusual for my field. If we're lucky, we've usually got an N of like 100. And for Mark's study, I had a sample of around 4,600, and then for Dario's, I had a sample of about 129,000. And so these are huge numbers that I'm working with. It's a huge privilege, but it's also a limitation, because that means that even when I'm using a powerful statistical methodology like latent class analysis, it means that all the results I get are significant. I found ways to manage around that. Statistical significance was not one of the indices I used, so I can talk a little bit more about that with the people who are interested in the stats part. But it's just important to note, on the one hand, huge sample size means verifiable and meaningful patterns in the data, but it also means that it might be a limitation of the actual statistical methodology that we used. Okay, so in my results from Mark's data, the main findings were that I was looking at the arrangement of the dominant with the auxiliary with the tertiary. And what I wanted to know was, do we have a judging and a perceiving function in the dominant and the auxiliary position? Is that true? And do we also have an opposition of attitude between the dominant and the auxiliary as proposed by Isabel Myers? And what I found was, in the majority of classes, so 60% of the classes, yes, in fact, we do have a judging and a perceiving function that are opposed in attitude, as you see in the image on the bottom right. But interestingly, in 30% of the classes that resulted, we had an interesting arrangement of still having a judging and a perceiving function in the dominant and the auxiliary, but they were the same in attitude. And when I panned out a little bit from the dominant and the auxiliary, I noticed that in the third most reported function, it was often the opposite attitude of a function that people already knew how to do. And so that really kind of piqued my interest, and also sort of very lightly confirmed that, yes, in fact, this is what people are needing to do as they grow through life, is they have two functions, and they end up needing to develop another attitude of one they already know how to do to achieve some form of balance. And so from this came, and I'm sure some of you have seen, these are new images, so get ready, but are familiar with the tricycle model, the bicycle and the tricycle model that emerged from the data. And the whole idea here is that when it comes to balance in the psyche, you can balance pretty well if you've got a dominant and an auxiliary that are healthily functioning together. But if you bring in a third wheel and you add a little bit of stability, it gives the psyche a lot more power, but also a lot more stability. And so that's what we think about when we're looking at sort of the pathways of development. Okay, so I'm going to show one more slide, and then I'm going to stop and ask if anyone has any questions. This is just a peek at one of the results tables from the original study from 2017. Don't get too lost in the numbers here. I think the important thing to look at is that we see a very consistent pattern of sensing, so a perceiving function, and then a judging function in the auxiliary, and we see both same attitude and different attitude in those positions, but in the third, we always have the opposite attitude of one of the functions that the person already knows how to do. Okay, so does anybody have any questions?
So yeah, if anyone wants to, because it's a webinar, if anyone wants to ask a question, the best place to do it is in the chat window. Yeah, this is a link also to Dario's thing, but that's the next one. So we'll wait for that one. So on the, just basically, Mina, on the study you've just been talking about, I think it's interesting to think about how we're actually asking the questions like what is being measured precisely. I guess, is this the expression of how much people are using these 8 functions in their lives at that particular point in their life when they're answering the questionnaire?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is one of the limitations of assessments, is that it is a snapshot of, you know, the reported use of a function at a particular moment in time. So there are some limitations associated with that. But, you know, when you have such a huge data sample, the pattern shows itself across the data rather than in that exact moment. And so while it does add a little bit of variety, I think, you know, the sheer power of numbers actually shows us the pattern. But to answer your question more specifically, yes, basically the way, I wasn't privy to the actual formula that Mark used to derive each function attitude score, but the degree to which they answered in favor of one function over another it correlated with the reported use of the function on the assessment itself.
So we're talking sort of about how it shows up, and so, you know, it would be interesting, would you like to study later, you know, what's sort of showing up is influenced by underlying tendencies versus environmental pressures versus kind of how people have consciously decided to be.
Correct. Yeah, that is sort of like, you know, one of the golden questions here. And I think actually when I show you some of the tables from Dario's data, I hope it stimulates thoughts around that same idea, because we did see some variations in Dario's data. With Mark's data, I got it in standardized form, but with Dario's data, I had it from the raw data. And so I think some of the variety that I see in that data actually might be explained by things like life circumstance or trauma or parenting or career and things like that. And so I'm curious to see what you think when you lay eyes on those results tables.
Another question is, you know, when we're looking at the functions showing up, I guess, are we sort of assuming that we're also using them productively or well, or they're, you know, as well, or are we separating that as well so that we can look at sort of with what kind of degree of success we're using the function?
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, Dario's assessment actually has that built into its how it's built, because he actually, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. It's a 48-item questionnaire, and he has 4 questions for each pure function. 2 of them are a basic use of the function, and 2 of them are an advanced use of the function. And so he actually has built in the relative degree of comfort or proficiency a person has with that particular function that it's testing.
So it's that sense of using a function in a balanced, appropriate way versus extreme or overuse.
Yeah, you know, that's a question for Dario. I mean, I can't speak to whether it's being used in a balanced way. I think the data can really only tell us how sophisticated the pure function is being used. And I know some of this is sort of artificial because it's hard to decontextualize the use of the dominant function from all of the other things that it functions in tandem with. But, you know, more directly, we're not really looking to see whether dominant and auxiliary are balanced. We're just looking to see, like, can this person use extroverted sensing in a basic way, or can they use it in a more advanced way?
Great. So a question from Christine was that she said, so as an INFP with dominant FI, auxiliary NE, she said, should I look at NI next after that in terms of conscious exploration? That's kind of, obviously the word should is always a tricky one in any coaching or therapy situation, but, you know, what would your take on that be? Like, is this a pathway that we're seeing as an ideal that should be followed potentially?
The short answer is yes, and you're jumping ahead of me, so I'll keep my answer on that one short. But yes, that is.
Yes, and for now. We'll see more on that in a minute. So Dario has actually jumped in and said, basic versus advanced use means more simple or passive use versus sophisticated active use.
Okay, there you go.
And that's actually going back to some of Jung's terms, because he does use the terms active and passive being almost more deliberate for active, and passive being it's kind of more automatic.
Sure. Yeah, so maybe it does tell a little bit about the person's relative health around that function. Thank you, Dario.
Yeah, thank you for that. Do keep correcting us if there's anything we need to know about.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. So let's go on to the next one. So I believe the next one was a link to Dario's instrument online, and this is free for anyone to take, right? Online. I think it is.
Yes, this is free to anyone, and that was one of both the strengths and weaknesses of the data set. So it's part of why we got such a huge N. It also adds a tremendous amount of variability into the data, and so when we were pruning out the data the data set, we tried to be really conservative and really only take data that came from the major sources like Google or Reddit. We also pruned out people below the age of 25 and over the age of 65. But yes, it is online, it is free, and if you want to participate in my future data, please go online and take it. So just a few words about the assessment. Like I said, it's a 48-item test. We ended up after, because we got the data in raw form, we ended up having to do the reliability and validity testing. And after all of that, we ended up using 32 items that had sufficiently high enough Cronbach alpha scores for that particular data set. And here you'll see just a few, I wanted to pull out a few of the items just to give you a flavor of how Dario's asking the questions. Really nicely worded. So here the first one, notice details in front of you match what you're accustomed to. So that's sensing, testing the sensing function. Offer various ideas and see what potential they might have. That's intuiting. Feel strongly that something is good or bad. Definitely judging, or sorry, feeling function. Okay. Okay, and so another one of the really nice things about the data set that we ended up with after we pruned was that we had a really beautifully even spread of dominant function groups. And again, this is just a snapshot of time. So we had to sort of assume that the highest reported score was the person's dominant function. I think again, with a data set this big, the sheer size of the sample carries us enough to make that a safe assumption, but it's something that needs to be named and considered. And I just wanted to also mention that after we did the reliability and validity testing, as often we do in statistics, we normed the data set and turned it into z-scores so that we could be able to compare them and do the latent class analysis. And something important to remember here is that rather than norming all the scores to the larger sample population, I normed each sample to itself. So the extroverted thinking sample was normed to its own population. The introverted thinking was normed to its own sample population. So thank you to John Haxton, if you're out there or if you watch this at some point in the future. That was a very valuable idea that you gave me in 2018, and I was able to apply that one here. And so we ended up with an N of about 129,000, which again is just huge. And so just a reminder, this is a table from the results of Mark's data. And ta-da, here are the results from Dario's data sample. So just a word before we dive into this welter of information here, I want to ask everyone to hold this data lightly. So don't get caught up in looking at the linear order of these preferences. Instead, relax your eyes a little bit and look at the top half versus the bottom half, look at the top 3 versus top 4, and just look at some generalities rather than getting stuck in the individual order of how these functions are reported. So you take a look here and you'll notice that Dario's data aligns pretty closely with what I found in Mark's data as well. And so looking at the largest class, classes 3 and classes 5, in class 5 we see that perceiving dominant, judging auxiliary, they're both in the same attitude. If we pan out just one more to the third function, we've got extroverted intuition, and one further down, we've got extroverted thinking. And so we've got that beautiful 2 forms of perception, 2 forms of judgment, beautiful balance of balances. And hopping over to class 3, a smaller class relative to the data sample, but still, similar results. Introverted intuition with extroverted feeling, what we might call an INFJ, and then they've got extroverted intuition and introverted feeling. So it supports, so these results really support the idea that as far as consciously accessible functions go, we tend to have one function in each process, and we tend to also want to develop those functions in both attitudes. I would imagine that that is a developmental process. So, in an earlier part of life, you probably don't have the balance of balances, but as you get towards midlife and beyond, you probably start to approximate that. That's just kind of my guess based on what I see in the data. So let's take a look at another table here. This one is for extroverted sensing. And again, you see the same thing. You see a perceiving function and a judging function, except for in class 4, which was sort of an odd group. But if you look 2 functions down in class 4, you see those 2 judging functions coming in. And that's kind of why I said, don't get too caught up in the actual order of the functions. Look at what's in the top half of the stack. And so we see the same pattern emerging. If we take a second and look at class 3, we notice that this person, whoever they are, has 3 judging functions. If we pan out to the top 4, it looks like they do have sensing, extroverted sensing, and they have feeling in both directions, and now they've developed another judging function somewhere along the way. So this could be a result of life circumstance like career, or like I said, trauma, maybe culture, maybe parenting. But ultimately, what we're really looking at is that what's in the top half of the stack. It's what we would expect to see, right? So we have 2 functions that are pretty accessible to us, and we tend to want to develop both of those in both attitudes. It kind of makes sense as far as proximity goes. Okay, so just to sort of concretize some of these results, for those of you who are sort of swimming in numbers at this point, in 64% of the resulting 44 classes from Dario's data, 64% of them had that tricycle configuration in the top 3 functions. If we panned out to the top 4, almost 100% of the data set, so 96%, had the tricycle configuration within the top 4 most reported or most used functions. And then this last statistic really surprised me, that about a third of the data, a third of the resulting classes had that beautiful, perfect 4-wheeler configuration. That number seems a little high to me, but again, we did have a pretty wide age range. So we had people upwards in their mid-60s, you know, so that's making the assumption that age has something to do with development, which maybe it doesn't always. Okay. All right, so I'm going to roll right along so that we have a little bit of time left over to just have a discussion. Applications. So what does this actually mean on the ground level? There's a very common misconception that in Myers-Briggs dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, inferior, it's actually a 1, 2, 3, 4 order. It's actually more like 1, 2, -2, -1, and there's all this stuff in between the -2 and the -1 and the 1 and the 2. And the point of this slide is to show that it's really actually more about the relationship of these functions to one another than it is about a linear order or a linear process of development. And my data really shows that as far as those relationships are concerned, if you have a judging function and a perceiving function, they create a system of their own, and they're really well balanced when you can have both attitudes of those 2 functions. And so in a more practical way, when I think about what this looks like on the ground level for my clients, what that really means for me, at least, is that if I have somebody walk through my door who's an INFJ and they're having some anxiety and some depression, they need to work through some you know, life cycle transitions, I want to do 2 things. Number 1, I want to make them a strong judger. I want to make them better at what they already know how to do and are predisposed to want to do. So I want to make sure that their judgment is functioning well. In an INFJ would mean that I would need to be balancing their dominant function, which is introverted intuition, with their auxiliary function, which is extroverted feeling, and get those 2 working in harmony with one another. It also means that I want to maybe help them learn a different form of judgment, like introverted feeling. And so, Christine, this should be answering your question. Just translate it for the INFP. So we've got a really well-developed dominant function. We've started to get it working well with the auxiliary, and now we bring in a third, either extroverted intuition or maybe extra introverted feeling to really help round out that person's development. And so the first task is, if they're J, help them be a better J. If they're P, help them be a better P. And so that necessarily means either developing the opposite attitude of the dominant function or the opposite attitude of the auxiliary function, depending on where you get somebody in their life, and just sort of more like individual characteristics that might dictate which one you choose to focus on in therapy. The other idea that comes out of this is that spending too much time focusing on functions that are less consciously accessible to us is something that should be done sparingly, and even then it probably looks very different than the process of developing functions that are more consciously accessible to us. I have some ideas around what that might look like, and so overall the idea is that health around the less preferred functions is more about the absence of pathology rather than the existence of competence with that function. And again, as people get more space and time in life, they might have more energy to work on some of these less accessible functions. One of the ideas that I had is that, maybe spend time around people who do your less preferred functions really well. Like, for instance, my father is an ESFP, textbook ESFP, dominant extroverted sensor, which is my inferior function. And being around him allows me to sort of posture or mimic the way he does extroverted sensing, because he does it so beautifully. And so it really gives me a way to watch how he does it and kind of mirror it. The other idea here too is that, particularly for the less preferred functions, is that you can work on the general function itself rather than a particular attitude of it. So just work on sensing in general, if sensing is one of your inferior functions. Work through intuition in general, if that's one of your inferior functions. But for more information on how you want to kind of prime the development of these functions and catalyze it, I will turn you over to my mentor, Dario, who I believe is going to be soon putting out a book about function development and coaching. So this really kind of concludes the basic information that I wanted to share about the research. Again, I'm really interested to know what people see when they look at these ideas, and particularly when they look at the data. And so I don't know if I can actually take questions from people and have a discussion, but maybe I'll turn it back over to you, Richard, to lead that.
Well, thank you, Mina. It's really great to see some of these results. And I know when we talked about this a few years ago at the BAPT conference, and you first had the idea of studying Dario's data, it was just an idea then, and now we're actually seeing some figures. It's really exciting. If anyone wants to ask a question, please put it in the chat. We'll go for another 10 minutes or so just to kind of have some discussion. And then we do have the power to invite people up to speak if we want, if they'd like to. One of my questions is about looking at this in context of how to interpret the data based on what we're actually asking people. And I guess I'm looking back at Dario's, you showed some of the example of the questions. Obviously, it's, next to that is how you mark it, and that is in a sort of 5-point scale. And it's from not me to exactly me, via somewhat me, and so on in the middle. So I guess what we're asking, the data is kind of asking, how much do I identify with this function as being me or like me? Which is, I guess that's the direct question we're asking. And then sort of what assumptions are we making from that in terms of quantifying it, in terms of how we're interpreting it?
That's your question to me?
Yes, it is. Sorry, yes. The question is so if what we're directly asking people is how much, they're answering how much they identify with this function description as them, and then we're sort of turning that into a sort of quantification of how much they use it, or how it's developed in a certain order. I'm just thinking about what levels of interpretation are we making on top of that basic question that they're answering?
Yeah, well, I think the most basic assumption that we're making there is that people actually can have a relatively realistic perception of what they don't do and don't do. And so that is kind of the major assumption there. I imagine Dario would have more to say about that piece of it, but we are relying on the fact that people can accurately self-report, which is a limitation of all self-report questionnaires.
Yeah, absolutely. I know Dario's offered something further to the instructions as well. He's saying the instructions indicate how skillfully you do what the phrase describes. So that's important, that people do read the instructions. I guess that's another assumption we make, that people have read the instructions. Because I'm not sure we always do we? That's a really interesting point as well. I'm always interested in how we interpret it. There's a question here from Kat. It's saying, is this research suggesting that my inferior function isn't necessarily the opposite in function and attitudes, i.e. her FE as being a dominant TI type?
This research, yes, in fact, that is what it's suggesting. Again, I think that has a little to do with, it's really difficult to measure functions that are unconscious is one thing, and that may be one of the reasons why we didn't see a very clear, I mean, I think if you look at it, the inferior functions are always in the bottom half of the stack in Dario's data. I'll just scroll back real quick here. Right, so the less, so for that first class, extroverted sensing, so the inferior function should be introverted intuiting. It's still in the bottom half of the stack. I know it's not very far down. So that could have something to do with it. Again, it's really difficult to measure what Jung would consider, less conscious. If you're asking me qualitatively, taking this data lightly and putting it aside for a moment, I would say that if your dominant function, what was her dominant function?
TI.
TI. So, I would say just very loosely that feeling is going to be an inferior function for you, particularly extroverted feeling, but I imagine just feeling in general is going to be inferior. And even if the data doesn't really support that, I still kind of believe it.
Thank you. So on the slides you've got there as well, it's interesting to look at that you don't really see what would be classically the ESTPs appearing. I want people with a TI as a sort of secondary or thereabouts function.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think so if we look at class 4, that's probably going to be the most approximate. ESTP maybe, it could be an ISTJ, we're not sure, it really kind of depends on, I think this is the sort of person where I'd want to speak to them face to face to get a sense of like, are they J, are they P, and that would help me make sense of, why these functions are stacked the way they are. But, again, these are just, what's the word I'm looking for? They're compilations, right? They're like, this isn't actually a person, this is just a pattern in the data that we tended to find.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you've got these quite strong, but not too. Isn't one that stands out as being hugely more present than the others. I guess 36 versus 33. Mm-hmm. And is this something you've seen across the board with all 8 of the different groups?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think the extroverted feeling group had a little bit of a more varied result, and that could have a variety of reasons, and again, I'm happy to share those tables in another meeting if that's something that you would like to see. But yeah, for the most part, this is a really pretty accurate representation of what the other classes looked like. It wasn't quite as neat as the 2017 study, and that could have something to do with how the assessments were built, but again, still the general pattern is consistent across both patterns of data. And I think that's important to me because, this data was in its raw form. It was pretty like, we started from the very ground up and still these patterns emerged. And so to me that, again, I hold it lightly, but, the pattern is still here and it's pretty clear to me.
Yeah. So I guess if we do interpret this as like how skillful we are, or how skillful we say we are in the self-report with each of these functions, then this is the pattern that's coming out from it. And how do we read into what might be behind that skill and in terms of development? How do you interpret how they got to that skill from, and what the pathway might have been? How might we look at that?
So your question is around how do you know that you're good at extroverted sensing, or how did you get good at extroverted sensing kind of thing?
Just thinking of the sort of, we're talking about this developmentally, like I suppose without looking at sort of the different points in the same person's life, is it how easy is it to kind of infer that how they got to the snapshot of where they are currently?
I think it's difficult because it is a snapshot, so it's hard to know anything aside from exactly what the snapshot is showing you, which is just, a moment in time where someone can gauge how well they think they do a particular function. And so I think it'd be really difficult to go into the past about it. I would say that it's, even on the assessment, I mean, I guess depending on what they type, it could be useful to say what the future of their development would look like. But I'm not sure that I could go back into the past. Do you have any ideas around that?
I'm just guessing, you know, if are we kind of assuming that, you know, there is still some kind of underlying preference there, you know, and then that's interacting with the necessities of surviving in the modern world, in the culture they're in the job, sort of in the family they come into, and the job that they're in, and you know that sort of essentially a lot of that is averaging out, and what we are seeing is kind of the underlying coming through, you know, separate to people essentially conflicting with their own type.
Sure. Yeah, I see what you're saying. You're asking about sort of like the idea of innate type versus express type kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, I think that could be a real pattern here. I would say that, I guess particularly because there often ends up being one function in both attitudes, I'm pretty comfortable saying that there was a predisposition to be comfortable with that function. You know, maybe in the patterns that have a little bit more variation in them, that's not the case. But, you know, for instance, like in class 1 here, I'm pretty comfortable saying that that person is like inclined to have feeling rather than thinking. You know, even despite having whatever life circumstances, they still seem to be comfortable with both attitudes of it. You know, maybe the sensing is to be determined, but even, I mean, I guess even looking at class 2, like they've got both attitudes of, sorry, that's not class 2, I'm thinking of class 4. They have a clear tendency towards thinking and sensing. Yeah. And they have both attitudes. So, and my guess is that if one of those weren't necessarily organic to who they are or how they functioned, that they wouldn't end up developing both attitudes of it. They'd probably end up eventually gravitating towards doing what did feel right to them. Kind of like the way I did with thinking.
So from looking at this, you know, is there a case to say we're more strongly typed in terms of function pairings than we thought previously, like NT, NF, ST, and SF?
Certainly, I think, and I think that's probably what my second to last slide was meant to depict. Yes, it is. It's about the pairing, because ultimately it's really about the system and the relationships that these functions have to one another, because they create balance. They create their own little system with one another. I think that, you know, it kind of is reminiscent of Beebe's model, where it has he has the arrangement of the 8 functions. It's not necessarily about the order or where they are, but it's more about the relationship of those functions to one another. The same idea applies here.
Yeah, and I guess, like you're saying, Beebe's model goes into another thing, looking at the qualitative way that these functions express themselves. And
yes,
there'll be some great research to do. You know, it's something I'm trying to create is, you know, questionnaires around that sort of area.
Yeah.
You know, that not the when we're looking at scale and expression of functions, that's separate to, well, you know, is one coming out in a more positive way and another in a more shadowy and difficult way?
Correct. That's exactly right.
But I guess in a sense, we could also say maybe we're looking at mainly the conscious side of the use of the functions here. You know, in the fact that if it's asking about what is like me, what I identify with, and in terms of skill, what I'm able to use, sort of, perhaps in a more conscious way.
Yes.
Is there also a scope for looking at this more deeply in the unconscious aspect of how the functions, or some of them are playing out in a more automatic and gripping kind of way?
That's right. And actually, what's really neat about framing it this way is that if we know which functions are conscious, we necessarily know which ones are unconscious.
Yeah, I guess it's a kind of inferent, yeah, directly from that. So there's lots of questions we could go into. I think we need to try and wrap it up, because we could keep going with this, but you know, we should have some more of these webinars to maybe dig more into this as we analyze it further. So like I say, thanks for sharing this with us. It's great to see this coming up.
Thank you so for the opportunity.
It's fantastic. And I think this is, it's a great start of, a new era in type where we can carry on doing some research that will help to integrate more with mainstream psychology in this way it is now, 100 years after Jung. It's great steps towards that, really taking it more systematic. So yeah, thanks. And let's plan some more webinars. And it would also be great to get together a sort of research group. I think there's some people on this webinar who would love to kind of do that as a BAPT initiative, something where we can collaborate our minds, put our minds together to find ways to really present more evidence for this stuff, which is clearly there, and deserves to be studied. So let's put that out there as well. If anyone's interested in a research group sort of discussion, then please do contact myself or Mina. She shared her email earlier, and we'll do that and get together, put our heads together. So let's wrap it up now. I'm going to ask you to end the thing because I made you the host earlier. So
okay.
I'm a passive visitor right now. But thanks very much. We'll see you later.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.